Never judge a book by its cover. It's a saying that we've probably heard our entire lives, but time and time again, it's a saying that's also turned out pretty true, not only in written works, but also in the realm of video games. The original Nier and Spec Ops being the prime example of games being so much more than what you expect from just seeing the cover of each game, or even seeing plain gameplay footage. Now, Scarlet Nexus doesn't subvert expectations like those games do. It's clear that's not what it's trying to do, and it's trying to deliver a good and fun action RPG that has a pretty cool setting with its Brainpunk dystopian backdrop. So why do I bring up the never judge a book by its cover adage? Well, when the initial trailers for Scarlet Nexus came out, if I was being honest, I didn't think it looked all that good. In fact, I was writing it off. I even thought it was going to be in the same vein as Code Vein. Pun not intended. In that I thought it was going to be another bust. Heck, I didn't even think the gameplay footage looked all that fun to me. But regardless, even with those preconceptions, I did decide to try out the demo when it first came out. And I was taken aback by how fun it was. It was so fun in fact that I decided to get the game on day one. And now that I played through the game twice and revisited it again a year later to play the DLC, I have to say that Scarlet Nexus is just a pleasant surprise. Especially coming from my initial impressions of the game when its first trailers came out. Now, it's no masterpiece and it does have its fair share of issues, but I can confidently say that it's a game that I very much enjoyed a lot when I was playing through it, even a year later. Not to mention that there are various aspects to the game mechanics and design that I was generally impressed by. So short story, I think the game's cool. Long story? Well, that's what this video is here for. Hello, I am Peter4789 and welcome to a discussion video about Scarlet Nexus, where I talk about what makes Scarlet Nexus stand out. Now the first thing I should say that I like is that I think the visual design of Scarlet Nexus is pretty rad. Now that statement has a bunch of caveats to it since there are some parts of the game that only looks okay. Like I think some of the environmental designs feel very typical. Like out of all the areas that you can traverse in the game, the abandoned subway, Kunan Highway, and the Mizuhagawa district is probably the most bland area in the game, with them pretty much just being your typical ruined urban area that you expect of the setting. Togetsu is a bit of a step up, but not by much I think. So yeah, those environments do look a bit bland, but I do think that Scarlet Nexus also has its fair share of pretty interesting environments to talk about. Kokuchiba, the old OSF hospital, the supernatural life research facility, and the Hino mountains are probably where the environments get a lot more interesting for me. Now, there's still the typical urban environments you expect, but I do think that both the OSF hospital and the supernatural life research facility exude their own type of atmosphere that's done through the lighting and music that makes them very memorable to go through. Kokuchiba is neat with how it's a abandoned mall district that's littered with the visions of the past cityscape in the sky. Not to mention the contrast from the upper level to lower level makes it very interesting to traverse through. And then there's our Habaki, which I think is the best area. It just gives off this fusion of a grand traditional Japanese shrine that's combined with futuristic machinery that makes the area overall looks really cool to go through. It also helps that the level design of these areas is handled well. Granted, most of the areas are fairly linear and consist of straightforward pathways and big rooms to fight enemies in, but these areas are designed well enough in regards to it being an action game. The areas are also designed with telekinesis in mind, with there being various objects in the background you can use in battle, with each of these objects varying depending on what area you are in. Such as you only being able to primarily throw these strange ice sculptures if you're fighting in the Hino mountains, to throwing various rubbles and trains you're fighting an abandoned subway, to throwing benches, vending machines, and telephone poles, or you're fighting Kokachiba. This is pretty good considering that the main powers that our protagonists have is telekinesis, as well as making environments feel more lived in and real in a sense, since the stuff you are using as ammunition does feel like it belongs to each respective area. All in all, I don't have many complaints about the visual design of the environments. At its worst, it just looks typical, and at its best, it's pretty cool. Which all does come back to what I was saying about Scarlet Nexus's visual design, of it having caveats of blandness, despite it overall being this really cool visual spectacle, at least to me. But let's get to what I think are the real standouts in the visual design. That is to say, the character designs and the Brainpunk aesthetic. The latter being an aesthetic that I haven't really seen before, but is incredibly welcoming to see. Especially with how psychedelic it can be, as you see how the game implements that aspect in the story, cutscenes, the game combat UI, and even how brain field is utilized. Combine that with a futuristic setting, and it's all a pretty cool setting, all things considered. As for the former, aka the character designs, I think they're pretty well done too, like I said. I think the way the game engine renders the anime-esque character models is really the star here. They just look fantastic in this game. The lighting is especially well done. It also helps that I do think the character design themselves is good, even if it's nothing too special. Especially like how each character got their own accessories and modifications to their uniform that makes them visually distinctive and interesting. Especially in regards to Kasane, Sugumi, and Hanabi, which are probably three of my favorite designs in the game. But I think the part of the visual design that stands out the most is probably the enemy design. Most notably the others. They just have this weird and otherworldly design to them that makes them especially creepy. Now each enemy design is clearly based on various creatures or concepts that we see in our everyday lives, like an animal or an object, but the game twists these designs in such a way that these enemy designs still feel really alien and trippy. And lastly, I almost forgot to mention this part in regards to the visuals, but there is one more thing that the game excels in regards to Scarlet Nexus' overall visual presentation, aside from the Brainpunk aesthetic and character designs. That is to say, the battle animations, which is pretty awesome. The battle animations in this game overall just has this kinetic flow to it that makes watching these animations to be a marvel, as well as doing a good job of making the heavy hits feel extremely impactful whenever you are using psychokinesis to hit an enemy with a heavy object. The animation do a really good job of selling you the idea of how someone would fight using psychokinesis in this universe and how cool that would be. And the SS abilities also looks amazing in this game, with it having these rad particle effects that makes using them in combat to be a spectacle on its own, which really does make you feel like an avatar of destruction that has access to all these different types of powers, which you get for the act of connecting with your teammates via the SES connection, as you see the SES cables get injected into your back when you activate them, which in turn does tie to the overlying imagery of the red strings and the themes of bonds and connections that the game has. But yeah, I'm a definite fan of how Scarlet Nexus look for the most part. In regards to discussing Scarlet Nexus, I would be remiss to not talk about how the game employs a storyline that revolves around two protagonists, with it giving you the ability to choose which point of view you want to experience the story in. In this game's case, it's either Yuto or Kasane. Now this concept has been used in various video games before, such as in Tales of Exilia and Muramasa the Demon Blade, but I do think it's still not used all that often, which does make this aspect unique to point out. With that said, I should talk about the implementation and discuss how different each route is and if you can play one route to get the gist of the story, as well as if there are any gameplay changes between the routes. Now to answer the first question, I would say the story bits that are the most divergent between the two routes is probably the middle section of the story, as the two leads split up and each have their own individual story arcs. That and the character stories you get with the rest of the party members are different depending if you pick Yuto or Kasane. Of course, the fact that you can interact with all the party members as Yuto or Kasane is kinda weird, considering that the middle section got the overlying cast of characters to be split into factions, and it's odd that opposing members of one character's faction would be okay with interacting with the leader of another. But I let that slide as the character stories are pretty good, which allows me to ignore that tidbit. And how that conflict is really between Yuto and Kasane at that point in the story. That, and I do think the character bonding does play a major factor into the story and make a major scene to hit really hard when you see how those bonds help the main character piece himself together in a rather interesting way using the game's world building. Well, it works really well for Yuto's storyline. I mean, the character bonding still works well with Kasane's story arc, but it's just that it amplifies Yuto's story beats by an even larger amount in comparison. Though I do think the character stories that she does get with the characters that are in Yuto's faction are quite good. At least good enough that I don't mind seeing them interacting with each other. Okay, got stuck in a weird tangent, but yeah. As you can see, there are certainly differences between the routes that make each distinctive, and I think that's a pretty good thing since it makes each route feel like their own thing, even if there are strong similarities in the starting and ending parts of the game. Now to answer the second question, that is if you can get the gist of the story from just playing one route. Well, I'd say the game does an okay job in this department. The game does do a summarization of what happened in the other faction storyline when Yuto and Kasane's path does converge back up, so it's not like you're missing the entire plot if you played through only one of the two storylines, but it's not the full experience. Now, is there an intended route to play the game? Not really, but if you are planning on playing both routes, I would honestly go with Yuto and then Kasane. I feel like playing as either route will still give you the basic gist of the story well enough, but I do think playing Yuto's storyline first is probably the better plan for a first playthrough, as I do think the heavier story revelations and the oh shit moments probably hit harder when you're playing through Yuto's story first, with Kasane being a good supplementary route to do after completing Yuto's storyline. Lastly, the gameplay differences. This is definitely the part that I would say is pretty significant. Now, I won't say that Yuto and Kasane play dramatically different from each other. I mean, they do fight with different weapons, with Yuto with his sword and Kasane with her knives, which does get you to play them differently in regards to how you use them in terms of spacing and weapon combo flow, but they still have the same telekinetic power, so they will still feel pretty similar to each other, despite the different nuances that their different weapon type will bring. What will feel different though, if you're playing as either Kasane or Yuto's route, is the party members. Like I said before, each route gets you to play with different party members depending if you're playing as Yuto and Kasane, and those different party members can make a first and second playthrough feel pretty different from each other. At least for the middle parts of the game. Like, Hanabi and Shiden does have fairly similar powers in terms of gameplay application, and it doesn't get more distinctive until you fully unlock their abilities at the end of the game, but I would say the other party member abilities are really distinctive from each other and hella fun to use, with the middle section of the game feeling pretty different if you play as either Yuto or Kasane. Scarlet Nexus also does a great job of crafting each playthrough to be suited to the party members that you have in a particular route, in regards to enemy placement and map design, which does make either playing through Yuto or Kasane's route a lot of fun, regardless of who you picked. With the main factor determining which route you find more fun is probably your own preference. But yeah, that's all I have to say about Scarlet Nexus' implementation of the Dual Protagonist storyline. Overall, I think it's done pretty decently. I like how each route has their own flavor that make each distinctive, while also making it feel very standalone still, even if you only play one route, which is good, since this is a pretty decently lengthy game, especially if you want to do all the side quests. With that said, there are some repetition to them which can make playing both routes feel a bit samey if you do play them back to back, such as with how there's no unique areas that is specific to a route, or how the start and ending of the game is basically the same, except with a different point of view. But I do think there is still enough differences in there that's still enjoyable even with that problem. Not to mention that the character stories are still different depending on who you choose as the main character. So it's not all the same even at the start and end. But before I end this section, I guess I should talk about how I think of Yuto and Kasane as characters, since they're the dual protagonists. Now, I have a section later on dedicating to talking about the character writing overall, but as for the main duo, I think they're good protagonists. They're certainly different from each other, with Yuto being the more typical protagonist you see in these games, aka he's a kind, well-meaning, and understanding guy who strives to become the type of OSF soldier that's able to save people, like how he was saved when he was younger, so namely a hero. In fact, the reason why he joined the OSF is because the person that saved him was part of the OSF. So from that descriptor, he does sound pretty typical, and he is. Not to mention that of the two main characters, he's pretty much static in terms of his personality, since he doesn't really change as a character. But I don't think it's to his detriment much, since I think he serves as a good way to develop other side characters and their character story due to his kind, down-to-earth, and understanding nature that remains constant throughout the course of the game. And I do think the game crafts an interesting arc for Yuto in the main story. Now, even though he does remain constant as a person, his situation, his worldview, and his place in the world does significantly change. Heck, his psychological well-being comes under attack too, in a good amount of the story. So it's interesting to see how Yuto will remain steadfast as himself throughout the main story and see where his own path takes him, and see how he's able to pull through it all, through all the hardships, and to still be able to move forward with his life and accept all the bad that has happened. Of course, there's the power of bonds and friendship in there too, but I think it's done well, particularly due to how the bonding itself is done well in the character stories. At both levels, you can see that the camaraderie and friendship Yuto has with his, friends help him become grounded and steadfast in the story's highly volatile situation, which allowed him to persevere and reach the point that he does at the end of the story. So I do think Yuto works pretty well for the game as one of its true protagonists. As for Kasane, I would say she is the more dynamic of the two. Compared to Yuto's more pleasant demeanor, I would say that Kasane's personality feels more dominant, with her more Ice Queen tendencies you see in her personality and mannerisms. What with her more assertive and calm nature, her cold disposition toward people who are not her sister at the start of the game, and her willingness to just speak her mind and not give a shit. Add in her awkwardness and understanding other people outside of her sister, due to how her sister is the only person she has a meaningful relationship with, and how she doesn't really care to make any other meaningful connections to anyone else, and you got Kasane's character in a nutshell at the start of the game. And she can overall be pretty fun to watch with her sort of straight to the point, no bullshit demeanor, especially with how she just trashed on some characters with how direct she can be, like when she interacts with Shiden at the start. Now, that's not to say Kasane is devoid of emotion. She does care a great deal about the people she's close to. The problem is that it's only limited to her sister Naomi at the start of the game, and she doesn't really see the point of getting close to anyone else. Kasane can also be quite objective and be willing to ask for self-improvement. At that same point, she's not afraid of pointing out how her other squad mates can improve, or at least ask why they fight like they do, to Shiden's dismay. Now, that objectivity only goes toward the practical side of stuff, as she's not very empathetic at the start of the game, even if she means well. Now I say all this since, unlike Yuto, Kasane does undergo a change of sorts throughout the course of the game, where she does become more open empathetically, and actually reaches out and forms genuine relationships and friendships with the people around her, and through those bonds is she able to grow as a person and be able to learn the same lessons that Yuto did, in being able to accept the loss of something close to you, or the loss of a loved one, and being able to honor their memory and to still be able to move onward toward the future, while being able to connect with the people around you, and how those connections still stay with you even if you are apart from them. So in the end, I would say Kasane is also a pretty well done protagonist in the game, like Yuto, though for different reasons. This is probably going to be a very short section, but I still want to highlight how the music in Scarlet Nexus just rocks. I don't know, it just sounds so cool and catchy as all hell to me, with its electronic, futuristic, and jazz themed soundtrack. Like, the only thing that gets kind of old is the hangout theme at the base, but even that theme still has a really nice tune to it. It's just that you listen to it a whole lot. But the rest of the tracks, I think is a banger. The field themes, I think they're all great, and it's good that each major area that you traverse through has their own unique themes that make each area exude their own type of personality and atmosphere. From the high energy and catchy tunes of the Mizuhagawa district to the somber themes of the Hino Mountain that gives off this feeling of isolation and of being in a place that's closed off from the world. Map themes are just awesome here overall, and even elevate the enjoyment factor of traversing through the main dungeon areas, like by a lot. I'm not kidding when I say that the dungeon or field themes just pops off in this game. The boss themes are also equally rad, with the other boss themes giving off this vibe of intensity and alienness to it that makes hearing them in battle not only intense as all hell, but also giving this off-putting feeling to it as well, which overall results in all the other boss themes being insanely memorable, which is apt since you're fighting others. And overall, I think the soundtrack at Scarlet Nexus is just wonderful and really unique in terms of how it sounds. Scarlet Nexus is really its own thing, I feel, in regards to its soundtrack, which is great. As for the general sound design, I think it's good in this department too. Everything sounds like it should, but I think the part of the sound design that they really excel at is the sound effects of the various SAS abilities that you can use. It just sounds so crunchy, for a lack of a better word. Like, teleportation sounds really cool when activated, as does hypervelocity, as you see not only are the sound effects somewhat muffled and slowed, but also the soundtrack is slowed down too, which is a really cool touch. They just did a really good job with the sound effects of the SAS abilities. It makes activating each feel like their own event. The voice acting is also pretty darn good, no complaints here. You have Chris Hackney voicing Yuto, Erika Mendes voicing Kasane, Megan Taylor Harvey voicing Hanabe, Zach Aguilar voicing Luca, and which is pretty funny since he voices Ether in Genshin Impact, Robo Burr voicing Arashi, and the likes. And they all do a great job of capturing the personalities of their respective characters and giving voice and life to them. Like, I think there are some odd deliveries made by Chris Patton when he's doing a few of Kaguro's lines in the latter half of the game, but I think for the most part, the voice acting is pretty strong here. I especially think Chris Hackney did a really good job of Yuto, with him being able to portray an understanding and genuine Yuto through his performance, as well as him doing a great job at the more emotional scenes with the character as well. Erika Mendes also did great as Kasane, with her being able to portray Kasane's more direct and even Ice Queenish persona pretty well, by also doing a good job displaying Kasane's more caring side when you see her interacting with characters she really cares about, while still maintaining her more direct and curt mannerisms. So yeah, I think they did a good job with the voice acting in this game, especially in the character stories. Speaking of characters, now, if you were to ask me what one of the main appeals to Scarlet Nexus is, it's probably going to be the characters. I mean, I think there are other reasons to love the game, but if you don't like the characters, I don't think you'll have a good time. This game is very character focused, with the game having a strong focus on bonds and connections as a theme. There's even a section of the game where it's pretty much dedicated to character bonding. Albeit it's optional, but you are very encouraged to do so if you want to fully unlock a character combat abilities, which has a huge impact, not only for efficiency, but also because the more fun upgrades are unlocked at higher bond levels. Heck, you can even see this theming of bonds and connections within the imagery of the game, via the motif of the red strings of fate, connecting everybody to each other. You see this in the SAS tubes that jets out whenever you use the SAS abilities, signifying that you're connected to your allies since, well, you can only use those abilities by being connected. You see this in how the cutscene UI have this red string motif integrated into it, as well as how the red strings is an actual power in the game and have huge ramifications and impact in the story, and how it was initially activated by the interaction of the two leads, and so on. So I would say that a decent amount of enjoyment of the game does come from liking the characters and enjoying their interaction and seeing their relationship developed, especially since there is a lot of dialogue in the game with the characters interacting and talking with each other, whether that be in the main story, character stories, brain talk, and even field banter. So what do I think of the characters then? In terms of the overall writing, I'd probably say the writing feels very safe. Safe, but very likable. Now, most of the characters do feel like they line up with various archetypes that you see in various games and anime. But to the game's credit, I do think they do give enough substance outside of their archetype that they still feel like their own beings, and not just derivatives of said trope. They do feel like people. Either that, or the game gives you insight on why the characters are the way they are due to their life experiences. Like with Hanabi, you can clearly tell that she is supposed to be the caring and supportive childhood friend who's in love with the main protagonist, and whose caring and energetic demeanor be the qualities that make her a wholly likable character. But she also has an arc in the game where she's uncertain on what path she wants to lead in her life for the future, due to how she didn't really have much agency in her life, with how she just went with the flow with what was expected of her, of both being part of the influential Ichigo family, as well as how she had to join the OSF due to her being scouted because of her exceptional SAS abilities. Granted, she does see the OSF in a good light at the start and isn't so reluctant to be a part of them, but her enlistment with them was done as a matter of course due to her abilities, and not as a choice on her part, unlike with Yuto, who did volunteer. And as a result, she feels sort of aimless, and when it's revealed that not only is the OSF and the Seoul government are involved in vile human experimentation, but also her own family, she ultimately reaches a point in her life where she contemplates of what she should do for the future, not as a member of her family, but as her own individual being, which gets her to finally have the resolve and agency to dictate how she wants to live her life on her own terms. Another example of the character writing that I would highlight would be with Tsugumi, where she's supposed to be the shy and timid wallflower who is more comfortable with plants than actual people, with her arc in the game being what you expect, with her bonding with Yuto and sharing more of herself, But the part that gets you to connect with her is both seeing how sweet and considerate she actually is, in that shy type of way, which gets you to like her, but also in seeing how she came out to be the way she is, and seeing the reason why she is distant around people is because she's been isolated from the people around her for most of her life, due to her clairvoyance making people wary of her and distancing themselves so that their own little dirty secrets wouldn't be revealed, and how those people even unjustly blamed her for it, despite her being so young when she was a child and not having the experience to control her powers, which does get you to feel for Tsugumi's predicament and understand why she is so withdrawn. And overall, I do think the writing of Scarlet Nexus, at least when it comes to the characters, is pretty good in making you connect with most of them, as well as the characters themselves being likable. Like I said, these characters are not wholly unique, and the writing itself does feel pretty safe, but I do think the game gives enough depth to these characters that you'll be able to like and connect with most of them, at least for the characters you'll be using most of the time. But character writing is not the only way the game is able to get you to connect with these characters. The other method is for giving gifts. Now, a gift system is hardly anything new in video games, especially in games that have a bond system. But I have to say that Scarlet Nexus probably has one of the best gift systems I've seen in regards to how it presents itself in the game, as well as how it even humanizes these characters and make you connect more with them. So what does the gift system do differently in this game? Well, when you give a gift to a party member in the hideout, you'll be able to actually see the gift being physically there in the hideout itself. Yeah, no joke. I know this doesn't seem to be all that significant, but it's a really cool feature when you consider that you don't even see the gifts in most video game gifting systems. Most of the time, they're just there to increase a numerical value and a character affinity system, and you don't even see their presence there at all. The only exception to this out of all the video games that I've played, besides this game, is probably Dragon Age Origins with Schmooples, which is the pet nug that you can give to Liliana in that game. But okay, seeing your gifts physically there in the hideout is pretty neat, and it's cool to see how each character's personal hobbies and tastes are reflected in how they decorate their corner of the hideout. But you're probably thinking it surely doesn't do much to endear the characters. It does when you see the characters interacting with their gift in the hideout. Yeah, when you give them something in Scarlet Nexus, you actually be able to see the characters interacting with it like a normal person, with each character having a unique interaction depending on what the gift is, especially if it's a unique gift that is tailored for them, like Luca lifting weights, Tsugumi watering her plants, Arashi and Kagero playing on a game console with each other, Yuto just lying on a Baki doll, the list goes on. These unique interactions added alongside with the normal animations you see in the hideout with the party members, like with Kyoka giving herself a back rub using her duplication powers, does a lot in adding humanity to this cast, in addition to the writing. Since it's one thing for a character to just say they like a certain hobby or a certain activity in a game or show, but to see that they are actively pursuing it in their free time through these animations, or even just seeing them chilling, it really does make them feel like people, which is great. It also helps immensely that these idle animations perfectly reflect each character's personality and interests from what we see in both the main story and character stories. Overall, I think the game does a great job of making an incredibly likable and engaging cast of characters, for both the writing and the unique interactions you see in the hideout, even if the characters themselves feel pretty safe in the grand scheme of things. We now get to what is perhaps the strongest feature in Scarlet Nexus. That is to say, the combat and all the systems revolving around that. But before that, big disclaimer, know that I am playing the PS5 version of the game, which does sport a higher frame rate than the PS4 version, with the PS5 version running at around 60 FPS, so take that as you will. With that out of the way, let's talk about what is perhaps the game's biggest draw, that is to say again, the combat. So what do I ultimately think of it? I would say that Scarlet Nexus probably has one of the most flowing and satisfying combat systems I've played in recent memory. Now in terms of offensive moves that you can do, I wouldn't say that the game is a powerhouse in this department, especially at first since you're mostly just relegated to having a standard attack, charge attack, aerial attack, and range psychokinesis attack at the beginning of the game. Granted, you'll be able to gain more offensive options as you progress via skill tree, increasing bond levels, how various SAS abilities can change how you interact with your various offensive moves, as well as how you unlock a super mode of sorts called a brain field later on. But I wouldn't say that Scarlet Nexus' strength in its combat system lies in it having a house of options, like in Devil May Cry, even though the offensive options that it does have are varied and meaningful. I would actually say that the strength of the combat system come down to 3 main points. The first is the unique combat flow the game has and emphasizes on when you're chaining your offensive options together. The second is the implementation of the crush gauge and how it helps create a satisfying combat experience that complements Scarlet Nexus' combat style. Thirdly is the SAS abilities that you get as you progress through the game, and the meaningful interaction you get from utilizing them. I would say overall that these 3 points are the main reasons why I think Scarlet Nexus' combat is as good as it is. But now that I said those main points, let's go more in detail about those 3 points individually. Now the first point to discuss is this game's rather unique combat flow. That is to say that the game really encourages you to mix up your melee and range attacks intermittently with each other in order to get the best results. A rather unique concept I have to say. Granted, there are video games that allow you to perform a combo that consists of both range and melee attacks, but to see the emphasis be put on doing combat in both ranges in equal measure, as well as being encouraged to consistently change between chaining melee and range attacks to extend your combo, well, that's not something you usually see, and it's interesting to say the least, especially the fact with how you're encouraged to consistently switch between your melee and range offensive options. I haven't personally seen a game encourage that type of playstyle before in an action game, or at least done it in a way that Scarlet Nexus has. So as I say, a pretty interesting concept, but an interesting concept isn't all what makes a game. The big question to ask is, how's the execution? Well, it's fantastic. The flow between melee and range attacks in Scarlet Nexus is perhaps the most fluid I've seen in an action game with how they execute it. The way how you're able to switch fluidly between a melee strike to backing off to throwing an object using your psychokinesis, and then back to closing the distance to strike the enemy again with either your knife or sword is just awesome. Not only due to how fluid the transition is between melee and range attacks, but also because you're encouraged to mix your range and melee attacks together. And this is due to how both melee and psychokinesis attacks are both useful and complementary to each other, to the point that it feels incredibly natural and satisfying to switch from melee to range, and vice versa when the time is right. With your psychokinesis being your heavy hitter that uses a sight gauge to deal both heavy physical damage and heavy crush damage, while your melee attacks are the attacks that will replenish your lost sight gauge with no external cost, as well as having the important job of steadying the crush gauge via keeping your combo of attacks going when you're doing your melee strikes. It also does intermediate damage to your enemies. Add in how your follow-ups, aka the attacks you do when you switch from melee to range, or vice versa, are the main ways to extend your current combo, as well as how it puts you into the perfect range to continue said combo depending on the follow-up. And you can overall see not only are your melee and range options useful by themselves, but also how those two offensive options perfectly complement each other and how they have this unique synergistic relationship that makes using those options in conjunction with each other to be a lot of fun. In fact, it's the result of this synergistic relationship between your melee and range options and the fluidity found in being able to seamlessly switch between those two offensive options that you get the mesmerizing offensive flow of Scarlet Nexus, of being able to fluidly switch between your melee strikes to your ranged psychokinesis options and vice versa to create an elaborate combo of attacks that overwhelm your enemies and make you feel like a badass. I cannot state enough how fun and addicting this game's overall combat flow is. But this is only a piece of the formula that makes the base combat as fun as it is. The other piece lies in the implementation of the crush gauge. So what even is the crush gauge, you ask me, since I referenced it a few times earlier? And what's its significance? Well, you can sort of think of the crush gauge as a secondary HP bar that you can deplete, that acts independently from the actual HP bar. And by the way, the crush gauge is a yellow bar beneath the red HP bar. Note that it's not like super armor if that's what you're thinking from my descriptor. Both the HP bar and crush gauge goes down from your attacks, so think of the crush gauge as its own independent bar. Albeit it's a bar that replenishes itself if you're too passive, but I think the general idea is the same as the HP bar, in that it's a bar that you aim to deplete with your melee and psychokinesis attack. So what do you get for depleting the crush gauge then? Well, once an enemy crush gauge is depleted, they'll be in a down state where you'll be able to perform a brain crush, which is a cinematic finisher type of attack that will outright kill most normal enemies and inflict a lot of physical damage to boss type enemies. So as you can see, the reward for utilizing this mechanic is insanely good as well as optimal, which is great since this mechanic actively supports and rewards both aggressive play and the game's unique offensive flow, due to how depleting the crush gauge is all about keeping up a barrage of attacks and alternating between melee and psychokinesis to do the most crush damage as fast as possible, thanks to the nature of the crush gauge replenishing itself if you're too passive. So not only are you encouraged and rewarded to play the game aggressively, which is the most fun approach to combat in Scarlet Nexus, but the reward for doing so is also satisfying as all heck, due to not only how downing enemies through brain crushes is the much faster method than just traditionally depleting their normal HP bar, but also due to how the brain crushes are these cool as heck finishers that are just a joy to witness. Granted, I wish there were more variations to them, especially for the range brain crushes, but I have to admit that the brain crushes that we do have do look incredibly rad still. All in all, I would say that the brain crush mechanic is a fantastically designed mechanic in Scarlet Nexus. Not only is it useful and satisfying to utilize, but the nature of the crush gauge itself also emphasizes the fun and unique offensive flow that the game has, as well as encouraging you to play an aggressive and fun playstyle while in combat. Well, I now covered 2 of the 3 main points discussing why combat works as well as it does in Scarlet Nexus, but let's now finally talk about the third and final aspect, that is to say the SAS abilities. So what are SAS abilities then? Well, the SAS abilities are essentially special powers that you get from your allies that you can use in combat for a limited time. But rather than being an entirely offensive tool like Yuto or Kasane Psychokinesis, you'll find that most of your allies' SAS abilities are more supportive abilities that will imbue Kasane or Yuto with special traits that will allow them to interact with enemies in interesting ways, such as the ability to warp to your enemies from far distances using teleportation, which not only allow you to close the distance instantly, but also allow you to more easily incorporate charge attacks into your repertoire, or activating a power that allows you to be in a state to not only see invisible enemies, but also make you deal more crush damage, as well as make your perfect dodge timings more consistent. It can also make the counterattacks that you get from your perfect dodge timings to be stronger. Strong enough in fact to actually knock down enemies. Heck, even the more basic SAS abilities like Pyrokinesis and Electrokinesis can change how you approach battle offensively, due to how your weapon is not only imbued with either fire or lightning, but also due to how your moveset is slightly modified, and how that modified moveset can change up how you usually do a regular combo and fight enemies. Then you got the more defensive qualities of Sclerokinesis and Hypervelocity to consider, where those abilities will allow you to stay in the face of an enemy longer in relative safety, which allow you to be more aggressive in those times. Though the way how they do that differ from each other, with how one makes you invulnerable, while the other gets you to enter a Hypervelocity state, where everything around you slows down to a snail pace, which will allow you to be more aggressive longer, as well as make it easier to react to any enemies since they are moving at such a slow pace. I feel like the game overall does a really good job at making each SAS ability to feel impactful as well as feel useful in its own way, whether you use it offensively or defensively, which really open up the meaningful options you have during combat. It's especially great once you're able to activate 3 or 4 SAS abilities together, which will really make you feel like a badass, as you can just do some absurd things when you activate a combination of SAS abilities together. Let's also not forget about Assault Visions, which are these type of special attacks that will allow you to use a percentage of your ally SAS gauge to directly strike an enemy using that ally. And overall, I think the game does a great job in the implementation of the SAS abilities. They just do such a good job of making each SAS ability feel like a meaningful and cool option to have in combat. But before I move on, I also have to comment on the enemy design here when talking about the SAS abilities, since you can see clearly that quite a few enemies are designed with a specific SAS in mind. Which you expect, and it's good that they are designed that way, but the thing that is most praiseworthy here, I think, is how there are multiple ways to deal with these type of enemies rather than just using one SAS ability against them. Now, this isn't true for all enemies since the visible enemies still require you to have clairvoyance, but for the rest, I do like how the enemies that do require specific SAS abilities are designed in a way that they can be taken down by other SAS abilities, such as being able to use teleportation or hypervelocity to take down the hyperfast others. Another example would be regarding the others that hide in their shells if you get too close, with you being able to handle that enemy type by either using invisibility to sneak behind them or using teleportation to instantly warp to them before they can go hide. I think it's really cool how you have multiple ways to deal with these type of others. Now, these enemies are probably designed that way to mostly fit the dual protagonist structure that the game has, due to how you don't have every party member with you in the middle part of the section. So as a result, they needed to design these type of enemies in a way that they can be taken down in a variety of ways so you don't get hard stopped by an enemy type if you go with either Yuto or Kasani's route. But I still think it's neat how it turned out that way, and it does feel pretty cool to have multiple options to take down these various others at the late game when you do get the full roster. At least I think so. Well, that's my take on the game's combat system, and why I think it's well put together and a lot of fun to play through. Overall, I really do think that the combat in Scarlet Nexus is exceptional. The way how the game crafts the combat system around psychokinesis, in regards to how it executes its melee and range offensive options, and how it put equal emphasis on those options, how it encourages and rewards offensive play, and how it implements SAS, is really impeccably designed in my opinion. I just had a ton of fun playing through the combat system, and I have to say that it's definitely a top tier action RPG combat system, probably one of the best I've experienced in recent years. Well, since we went over the combat, let's go over the other parts of the gameplay, namely the progression systems. So, how are the progression systems found in Scarlet Nexus? I would say that they're pretty good. Now, the act of progressing through these systems is pretty typical, with it having a pretty standard leveling system that uses experience, as well as a standard team bonding system that gets you to earn affection points through gift giving. But I do think the game does a really good job of making each upgrade feel impactful through some of these progression systems, especially when you're raising bond levels. Each bond level upgrade you get from your allies to improve their SAS abilities all feel substantial and rewarding, with you being able to increase the general effectiveness of that SAS ability, increase the time they can use them, and you can even unlock offensive options via assault and combo visions. And when I say substantial, I mean substantial. The magnitude of power you get from upgrading your SAS abilities through the bond level upgrades is just nuts. I mean, look at Duplication, where one of the upgrades give you an additional clone, and another upgrades increase the number of duplicated thrown items when you're using Psychokinesis. Both of these upgrades can double or triple your base damage, which can be insane, especially when you pair Duplication with Clairvoyance. Another example would probably be Pyro and Electrokinesis, where their final upgrades can be kinda bonkers, with you unlocking an additional move when you activate either Pyro or Electrokinesis depending on the move. And it's a move that deals a ton of damage, by the way, especially when you pair with Duplication, Clairvoyance, and Hypervelocity, since it's a move that gets you to stand still for a while. So when I say the bond level upgrades are substantial, I mean it. Yeah, the progression through bond levels is fairly simple and straightforward, but I can't deny that it feels satisfying as all hell when you do increase the actual bond levels with each of your party members. So yeah, the bond level progression system is pretty well done, even if it is pretty straightforward. But it's not the only progression system in the game. Let's now talk about the main progression system that the game has, and the one you'll be interacting with the most. That is to say, the leveling system, equipment system, and the skill tree. Like I said previously, the game has a pretty standard leveling system, with you getting experience from fighting others, and when you get enough, you'll level up, which gives you stronger stats, as well as give you additional skill points that you can use in the skill tree. The equipment system is also pretty standard, where you just get the equipment with better stats, either from the vendor or by crafting them. Where the progression system gets interesting is in the skill tree itself, the brain map. Now, it functions pretty similarly to other skill trees found in other RPGs, where you are using your skill points to unlock various nodes within the skill tree, which unlock various upgrades and moves. But I will say that the skill tree found in Scarlet Nexus is rather expansive, with there being 5 branches of upgrades that you can choose from, with each branch focusing on a particular type of upgrades. The branches are Expand, Enhance, Support, Brain Drive, and Brain Field. Expand primarily focuses on skills that improve your general moveset, which both involves learning new offensive moves as well as getting upgrades that improve your general mobility. Enhance revolves around upgrades that improve your general stats, and will not only increase your own stats, but also increase the effectiveness of your attacks against enemies, such as increasing your crush damage or regular damage against enemies, or getting a skill that gets you more sight gauge from doing aerial melee attacks. Support, as the name sounds, primarily revolves around skills that give you supportive abilities that can enhance your character in battle, which ranges from letting your character get more equipment slots to letting you activate more SAS abilities in battle. And finally, the Brain Drive and Brain Field branch give you upgrades that improve your performance while you are in those respective modes, which are like super modes of sorts. So it's pretty plain to see that the brain map itself is pretty expansive, with there being a wide variety of skills that you can get with the skill points you earn as you level up. Which is good, as it allows progression to feel varied when you are deciding which specific upgrade you want to get from a particular branch in the brain map. It's also great that each branch has good skills that make investing in each particular branch to feel meaningful and interesting, as well as varied, such as getting the concurrent SAS activation skill in the support branch, or the brain drive skills that let you restore SAS gauge when you enter the mode, most of the enhanced skills in the brain map, and so on. Granted, not all skills are created equal, and there are certainly some skills that feel or are filler for a better skill, but I do think there are more than enough good skills in each branch that makes utilizing the brain field to be an engaging and rewarding progression system. And overall, I would say that the progression system is done well. It's fairly typical when you get down to it, but I do think it does a pretty decent job of making those upgrades feel meaningful and interesting, at least when it comes down to the bond level and the brain map progression systems. I'll say that the traditional leveling system and the equipment system just feels pretty standard. So, you guys have now pretty much heard what I like in Scarlet Nexus and why I really dig it. But like all things, there are a couple of flaws in the game that can make the experience less than ideal. One of those issues is the story flow. That is to say that the story flow in the first few chapters can be a bit meandering. What I mean by that is that there's not much agency or driving force that propels the story forward in those first few chapters, or at least make the world interesting. Now granted, those first few chapters do introduce all the meaningful characters in the game, and it does a good job of that, but there's not much of a story hook there. It's basically just the main lead joined OSF, they get introduced to the squad mates, and then they do OSF missions together. It's like that into the subway mission, which is where you get interesting revelations about others, and how people can be turned into them, and how there could possibly be a government conspiracy going on, and how it could possibly involve human experimentation. And then it gets escalated further with there being a split within the OSF itself, which leads to open rebellion, which then leads to the event of how the red strings are introduced, and how Yuto and Kasane go on the separate paths in the story, and so on. So it's not that I think the story isn't interesting, in fact I think it does get intriguing at the subway mission and onwards. It's just that the parts before that can feel a bit boring, since not much happens in those segments. I mean, like I said, it's just basically the main cast doing OSF missions together and getting used to each other. There's not like an interesting mini arc that happened during those segments. And as a result, the game unfortunately can feel extremely slow at times. Heck, I'd probably even say that the game has issues in making the world feel interesting at the start, since not much world building is done at the beginning. All the meaningful world building is done like at the latter half of the game, which can add to the meandering feeling you get when you're starting the game. Now granted, I do like the character building done in the intro segments, and you still get the character episodes during those chapters, and I do find the story engaging enough after the subway mission, but that doesn't change the fact that the starting segments of Scarlet Nexus can feel uneventful and slow at times, which is a shame. Another thing about the story that I have an issue with is probably the rebellion between Suo and Seiron, mostly due to it getting put into the back burner at the halfway point when the whole Togetsu arc begins, with the Suo vs Seiron plotline not really having a satisfactory conclusion in the main story itself. I mean, we do expose the wrongdoings of Suo at the end, but Seiron hardly gets any limelight at that point of the story. It just sort of fades into the background without any satisfying payoff, which can make the rebellion part of the plot to feel like it was wasted. Now granted, the main crux of the story does revolve around the red strings, Togetsu, and the themes of bonds and connections, and how those connections can not only help you move forward, but also how they can still stay with you, even if you are apart and keep pushing you onward. As well as the themes of being able to move forward with your life through tragedy and to not be trapped by that past. Yeah, the story revolves around those elements, and I think the game does a good job of telling that, but it's still disappointing to see how a plot point that the game introduces early on gets put on the wayside later. Another big issue I have with the game is the side quest design. Now, this being an RPG, there are of course side quests that you can partake in, but I do feel like the way they designed the side quests in this game make them feel like such a pain to go through in regards to how you complete them. Now, getting the side quests isn't too bad. The game actually does a good job of marking which NPC has a side quest on your map, so finding and starting your side quest isn't much of a problem. What is a problem though is the actual tasks that you have to do in the side quest itself. They're sort of a pain. Now, I don't have much problem with the base eliminate X other side quest, or the side quest that gets you to eliminate a specific enemy. I mean, yeah, the side quest itself doesn't really give you an indication on where you're supposed to track down the specific enemy that you're hunting, but at least there's a beast tree in the game that will allow you to see where each enemy in the game is located. My main problem with the side quest is when they decide to give annoying modifiers to the base side quest design, with you not only having to eliminate a specific type of others, but do it in a specific way that involves finishing off an enemy with a specific type of ability, and if you don't finish it off with that specific ability, it doesn't count, which can get really annoying when some of those side quests requires you to finish off an enemy with a specific ally combo vision, which means you can't finish them off with a brain crush, which means you have to deplete their health the old-fashioned way, which can be so time-consuming. You also have to watch out that you don't kill the enemies with regular attacks as you chip it down. And you can probably see why I said that the side quests in this game are really annoying, especially when the base side quest structures have those special modifiers. The worst part about this is that the reward structure for these side quests suck. You mostly only get cosmetic rewards with no real gameplay benefits outside of a few quests that reward weapons. You don't even get experience or kin/money from these side quests for completing them. There's also not much story in these side quests as well. So yeah, the side quests in this game are handled pretty badly, which is a shame since the combat system is fun as heck in this game. Hopefully they improve the side quest design if this game has a sequel. Well, these are the major issues that I would say actively hampered my experience in the game. At least for me. But there are also a few issues that I noticed here and there that, while not major, I would appreciate if they fix it in the future. The first is I wish there was a gauge that would tell you how far you are in progressing your bond levels with each of your party members. It would be a good quality of life, I feel, if you could see that, why you are increasing your party members' bond levels. Heck, I would even go so far as to change the bonding system to increase depending on the variety of gifts you give, rather than just each gift having a set amount of affection points. That way it would cut down on the monotony of making the same gifts over and over again just to increase the character bond levels, and will make each new gift you create and give the feel more special. The game already has a system in place, since that's how team bonding level works, so I feel just implementing to all bond levels would be the best thing to do. At least, I think so. Another small issue I have with the game is the brain field, to a degree. Well, more so that I think is a tad underwhelming at the start of the game until you get some upgrades to it. Like, I think the concept is cool, but the base power and abilities you get from the brain field when you initially get it really feels underwhelming, with how you don't even get any damage reduction at base activation, which is a problem with how a lot of the moves during brain field are these heavy attacks that lock you in place. I think if one of the damage reduction skills was implemented in base activation, it would make brain field feel a lot more badass. Granted, once you do get other upgrades, it does feel like a pretty badass super mode, but I do think it's a tad underwhelming at the start. Lastly, and this is a pretty big nitpick and something I discussed before, but I do wish there were more brain crush animations for each enemy. Wait, scratch that, I wish there were more cool looking ranged brain crush animations for each enemy, since the melee one looks really cool as all hell and unique. Not so much for the range ones. Well, we've almost reached the end and have pretty much talked about all the main points about Scarlet Nexus, at least in terms of the base game. There are still the DLCs to talk about. Well, at least the meaningful ones, since there are a bunch of DLCs that are just costumes, which is pretty typical to see in a Namco Bandai game. Well, now that I think about it, I should probably also talk about the mission simulator, since if you play Scarlet Nexus at launch and beat it around that time, the Vision Simulator is a semi-new thing. That and I haven't talked about it yet, so yeah. So the Mission Simulator, what is it? Well, it's basically an interface that will allow you to partake in a bunch of challenge missions. So yeah, pretty simple explanation. As for my thoughts on it, I think it's a really good addition to have. And it's great that this inclusion was added for free as an update in version 1.05. It's basically served as post-game content that's designed to test your mastery of the combat system at the end game, which is great since the combat system is like one of the best things about the game. So any content that gets you to partake on more of the combat system is pretty good in my books. And I do think that the Mission Simulator do a good job of making its challenge feel interesting, since each mission does have its unique spread of enemy encounters that does make each encounter feel a bit unique on their own. I also think it's cool how you graded on your performance, since that can be a pretty good incentive for self-improvement and make you want to keep trying till you get an S rank. The rewards you get from the mission are also pretty good. So I would say overall that the mission simulator is done really well as far as post-game content goes. But let's now get to talking about the meaningful DLCs that are in the game. That is to say, the Bond Enhancement Packs and the Brain Eater Packs. I'll start with the Bond Enhancement Packs. This DLC pack basically gives you more character Bond episodes. There is gameplay addition too in the form of additional Bond levels and the upgrades that go along with those Bond levels, but I would say the main appeal of the Bond Enhancement Pack is the character episode themselves. And I'll say that they're pretty good. I think the element that makes them stand out from the usual Bond episodes is that each Bond episode in the DLC deals with a trio interaction, rather than just a regular one-on-one that you get from the main game, at least for most of them. The additional character does make these Bond episodes interesting, as you not only get interesting scenarios that deals with why these three characters are hanging out, but you also get to see various character interactions that you normally don't see in the main game, and you even learn more about these characters' past impressions of each other, which is pretty cool to see, especially if you like the main cast in the main game. Suffice to say that I really enjoy these Bond episodes. I also have to give a shout out to the Bond episodes that gives a bit more story to Naomi and Nagi. It's pretty nice to see their characters expanded a bit, especially since they don't have a lot of screen time in the main game. I mean, their presence in the story is still very much felt, but I do wish that we had more time with them in the main game. So seeing a Bond episode dedicated to talking about Naomi and Nagi is really nice. And overall, I would say that the Bond Enhancement DLC is worth it if you really like the characters. Then there's the Brain Eater DLC, which is a DLC that's dedicated wholly to Karin. Now, this is mostly just a story DLC that gets you to explore more of Karin's character and see how he got to the point that he's at the end of the game. Granted, you also get an extra boss fight in the mission simulator, and you have to complete that to view the last episodes of Karin's story, but I would say that the story parts of the DLC are the crux of the Brain Eater pack. As for my thoughts on it, I would say that the story is good. I think the DLC does a great job of highlighting the tragedy of Karin's character, as well as the relationship between him and Alice. You really do feel for the man as you see his predicament in the story episodes, and understand why he would try to abuse the power of the red strings, and why he did what he did in the main game. I mean, we already got a sense of this in the main story, at least enough of it to know where he's coming from when we're fighting him in the base game, but the DLC does a great job of expanding Karin's character, with it letting us understand him more as a person, and even getting us to further empathize with the motivations behind his actions. So in the end, I would say that I enjoyed the Brain Eater pack a lot. Well, I have more or less discussed my overall thoughts on Bandai Namco's Brainpunk JRPG, Scarlet Nexus. Overall, for a new IP and just as a game, I think it's a pretty well done action RPG. It has an interesting world with its Brainpunk aesthetic, a good cast of characters, with the game possessing one of the best gifting systems I've seen in a video game, and it's a gifting system that helps make each character feel like their own being as well. It has an addictive combat loop that feels engaging from start to finish, with Scarlet Nexus having one of the most flowing combat systems I've experienced, and it's got pretty good and engaging progression systems too. There are problems with it, of course, such as with the side quest design, but I have to say that Scarlet Nexus really caught me off guard with how well designed it is as an action RPG, with it being a really fun experience overall, which really gets me to look forward to a sequel, especially with the story implications that can happen from what we know from this game. Seriously, I am pretty excited for a possible sequel if I'm being honest. But even if we don't have one, I will say that Scarlet Nexus ended on such a satisfying end that I wouldn't mind if it ended at the first game. And I just think that the game overall is just a great experience, especially with its characters and combat systems. Well, that's it for me. This is Peter47890 Sirus signing off.
Every one of us is born alone. But even though we're alone, we can connect with each other. Where we are doesn't really matter.
Kasane, I'll keep living, no matter what.